Hello again, Governor of Ohio, Mr. Mike Dewine. To reintroduce myself to you and all new viewers of this channel, my name is David Roush. I am a friend of an innocent man who is on death row in your state, Mr. Keith LaMar. Today is January 28th, 2026. In 50 weeks, the state of Ohio plans to execute Keith for crimes he did not commit. I am going to send an open letter to you every week until January 13th, 2027, urging you to grant Keith full clemency and set him free. I will also read these letters to you on weekly episodes of this YouTube channel in the hope that the American public knows about Keith and joins the cause for his liberation. I encourage people of conscience in America and throughout the world to join in Keith's cause and urge you to do the right thing. Set Keith LaMar free. In today's letter, I will review chapters 5 and 6 of Keith's autobiography, Condemned. Keith's book is a sobering account of his more than 30 years of incarceration, most of which he has spent in solitary confinement. It is replete with powerful reflections on class, race, and carceral injustice in America. It is outstanding for its eloquence, narrative detail, and emotional power. Most importantly, it is an extremely compelling testament to his innocence. The first 4 chapters, which I reviewed in last week's letter, are the beginning of his compelling testimony in front of the court of public opinion. If we listen to the man with open-hearted compassion, and if we listen to our basic sense of humanity, chapters 5 and 6 should only move us further. Before I delve into my review of chapters 5 and 6, however, I want to describe 3 primary themes that arise from this portion of his book. First, human strength is best exemplified by principled nonviolence and mercy, not by violent revenge or cruel punishment. Keith is an exemplar of this principle. Over the 3 decades of his incarceration, he has developed an iron will of nonviolent stoicism against the cruelties he has suffered by the prison system, from its highly esteemed judges and prosecutors to the guards that have tried to dehumanize him through vicious beatings, harassment, manipulation, and mockery. This principle of merciful nonviolence is one you should follow yourself. Mercy empowers restorative growth and true healing of individuals and communities. Revenge and punishment annihilates this potential in oveo. As Keith has learned from his reading of James Baldwin, hatred never failed to destroy the one who hated. This applies both to individuals as well as nations. If America is to avoid self-destruction, its public officials must take heed of Baldwin's wisdom as Keith has. Second, on page 105, Keith uses the metaphor of quicksand to describe the torture he has suffered during his incarceration. He relates an interesting counterintuitive fact about the common wisdom with regards to how to free oneself from quicksand. One must be patient, move slowly, and breathe deeply. Deep breathing helps one be buoyant, and careful, purposeful actions maximize one's chances to free her or himself from quicksand. Abstracting from this metaphor, Keith has learned that he must assume this very mindset to survive his imprisonment. Again, you should model your own actions as governor of Ohio after Keith's example. Instead of acting with rash, punitive vengeance and continuing the policy of capital punishment, you should breathe deeply, act with patience, and practice mercy. The volatile throes of punitive violence are a kind of quicksand that only causes more harm than it heals. Free yourself from this quicksand, practice nonviolence, and perhaps America will start to free itself from the quicksand of bigotry in which it is enmired. Finally, Keith has survived the past 3 decades of torturous incarceration by listening to what he refers to as his inner voice. People describe this phenomenon in different ways. Socrates called it his nous. Whatever we call it, our inner voice is our genuine moral and practical wisdom, expressed in the language of our personal and cultural history. Keith has heard his inner voice call him back from rash violence, even when provoked by the brutal prison system, its judges and prosecutors, and its guards. It has spoken to him through the tender compassion of many people, both his loved ones and his favorite authors alike. Most notably, Keith has kept the memory of his deceased grandparents in his conscious awareness as they have spoken to him through his inner voice, again, guiding him away from vengeance and toward mercy. I urge you, Governor, to listen to your inner voice. An article published on Cleveland.com on December 15th of 2025 reports that you will make a public statement regarding your thoughts on the death penalty in this month. You have intimated in several public statements that you are opposed to the use of capital punishment. People of conscience in Ohio and throughout the world still eagerly await your statement. We encourage you to use your inner voice and settle this matter by granting Keith full clemency and setting him free. Now, let us turn to chapters 5 and 6 of Condemned. Chapter 5, Death Row 1, Walking Through Hell, is an account of the beginning of Keith's journey after he was wrongfully convicted of killing 9 men in the Lucasville prison uprising in April of 1993. On August 21, 1995, the day of his conviction, Keith was transferred to Mansfield Correctional Institution. Keith notes that Reginald Wilkinson, director of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, decided to move death row inmates to a different prison so as to reduce, quote, the potential of guards forming emotional attachments with the condemned. Page 64. The execution chamber was in Lucasville Prison, and so the guards would regularly interact with the condemned inmates if they had remained there. This would contradict the practice of brutal harm that was the policy of the prison system, which was unacceptable to Wilkinson and the ideology of the prison system at large. Keith noticed the, quote, warm and welcoming facade, unquote, of the prison as he arrived, which betrayed the evil that lurked within, he says, on page 65. His hands were swollen and red after being cuffed for a 3-hour drive. He was then given a new prisoner number 317-117, which corresponded to the fact that he was the 317,117th prisoner registered in the state of Ohio. Shortly after he arrived, he was reunited with Jason Robb, a man with whom he had forged a curious friendship. Considering the fact that Keith is a black man, Jason was another convict related to the uprising and was also a member of a white supremacist organization known as the Aryan Brotherhood. Despite his membership in this group, Keith, Jason, and 3 other inmates, one of whom was also a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, would come to be known as the Lucasville Five. They would help each other tremendously with their shared challenges. Not long after Keith arrived, a guard presented him with a piece of paper that asked him to choose his preferred method of execution, the electric chair or lethal injection. In his cell nearby, Jason was there for Keith as he struggled to absorb the distressing and angering reality in which he now lived. On September 3, 1995, Keith's attorney Herman Carson filed a motion for a new trial. He and Keith knew that the court and the judge had overseen to recall the title of Chapter 4, a, quote, mockery of justice, unquote. Here is a review of the primary examples of this mockery of justice from the first 4 chapters. Keith clearly had nothing to do with the uprising, as it was caused by Sunni Muslims who had, for religious reasons, refused to take a tuberculosis test forced upon all prisoners, regardless of their religion. Because Keith was not a Muslim and had already taken his tuberculosis test, he had no reason to participate in the violence on that day. If it did not have such a disgraceful consequence, the prosecutor's case against Keith would be laughable. Second, Keith's verdict had been decided on by an all-white jury who had been primed by racist propaganda all of their lives to view Keith as an evil man without human dignity. 2 black potential jurors, one of whom who had expressed moral disagreement with capital punishment based on her Christian faith, were unconstitutionally removed from the selection process. There had been a crowd of white people at his sentencing, none of whom who had been present during the trial, all but frothing at the mouth to see Keith receive his brutal sentencing. The prosecution and the judge had frivolously withheld exculpatory evidence from the defense. Witness statements were pointlessly disconnected from the witnesses who had made them, and numerous witnesses were shown to have been compromised through inappropriate relationships with the prosecution as well as mental illness. Finally, another inmate had already admitted to killing one of the men Keith was convicted of killing. In addition, the fact that all of the prisoners, Keith included, had been treated brutally while in prison before, during, and after the uprising is itself an indictment of the justice system. It demonstrates a core theme of the book. America is a plutocracy, a country that is run by and almost entirely for wealthy people, to the detriment of poor and working people. The prison system is one of its tools toward this end. Though plutocracy exploits and harms all poor and working people, its harms are disproportionately more severe to people of color and other marginalized communities. Shortly after Keith's attorneys filed this motion, another inmate at Lucasville Prison admitted to killing yet another one of the men Keith had been convicted of killing. The judge scheduled Keith's hearing for a new trial in Meigs County, another all-white town. At the hearing, Keith's attorney reviewed the aforementioned faulty practices of the prosecution in the court. However, the judge rejected the motion, wishing him good luck as he passed by Keith while exiting the courtroom. His flippant tone in this bizarre well-wishing was a nasty insult. Keith's descent into the quicksand of his suffering was augmented by the death of his beloved grandfather. His account of his last call with his grandfather on pages 78 and 79 is profoundly moving in itself, and is also a critical moment in Keith's psychological development. In fact, it anticipates a lesson he would later learn from James Baldwin. To restate the quotation I stated earlier, hatred never failed to destroy the one who hated. In their last phone call, Keith's grandfather gave him simple, loving, and supportive advice. Take your time. You have to let go of all the pain inside of you. As tears streamed down his face, they shared a last I love you too, just before the call was cut off by the automated system of the prison. While Keith struggled with his wrongful death sentence, the death of his grandfather, and the death of his grandmother, which had occurred toward the end of his trial, the other members of the Lucasville Five also arrived at Mansfield Correctional Institution. As soon as they arrived, the prison began to subject them all to strict administrative control. They were kept in solitary confinement, denied phone use and the use of the postal system, and were allowed only the absolute bare necessities of survival. In protest of this treatment, the Lucasville Five made their first attempt at a hunger strike. However, George Scatses, one of the Lucasville Five, suffered through extreme stomach problems that the prison neglected to address. Despite their efforts, the prison's brutal administrative control was unrelenting. Keith would regularly wake up out of nightmares of his execution, punching the walls of his cell. After being subject to this for another year, the Lucasville Five began another hunger strike, but with greater commitment. It is important for us to meditate on the fact that their suffering had been so bad that they eventually decided to perform this staggering challenge at all, let alone twice. They persisted for over a month. During that time, Keith noticed that he was being watched by secret cameras surveilling his cell. As the prison continued its torturous administrative control, Keith decided to write them a letter about the bases and goals of their hunger strike. He rightly claimed that their treatment was a second punishment for the same offense. In simple, direct language, he demanded that the prison attend to George's medical condition. Referencing the prison's responsibilities in a 21-point agreement that was drawn between the Lucasville prison and the prisoners, Keith rightly demanded that they be given their normal privileges and their personal belongings. Though the prison should have honored Keith's requests, his letter fell on deaf ears. After more than 4 weeks of his hunger strike, Keith was incapable of continuing this arduous protest. George had warned him that the prison's policy, like the forced tuberculosis test of the Sunni Muslims at Lucasville, was designed to beckon them to do something rash for which they could then be punished. Though Keith saw the wisdom of this advice, Keith could no longer withstand the anguish of his self-starvation. In the bitterness and hopelessness of this experience, he fell into a quicksand of chaotic reactivity. In this state of distress and weakened focus, he devised a plan to ravage his pod with the hope that he would be relocated. One afternoon, some weeks later, he escaped from his cell, handcuffed the 3 guards assigned to his pod, and placed them unharmed in a nearby conference room. He then freed the other prisoners in his pod from their cells and encouraged them to make such a mess of it that it would be unlivable. Again, it is important for us to note the fact that though Keith acted forcefully in this circumstance, he demonstrated remarkable self-control for somebody who had experienced what he had experienced. While the guards were shackled and utterly vulnerable to him, Keith could have acted violently. One of the guards even expected him to do so, pleading with Keith that he might be spared sexual assault. Keith was surprised by this, as this had never been his intention, and this particular guard had a habit of relating to Keith in a sadistic manner. Again, instead of acting with rash vengeance, however, he put the 3 guards safely in a conference room. They were rescued shortly thereafter by another guard. Keith only harmed the personal property of the prison, again with the understandable, albeit futile, hope that they might stop their torturous policies. The prison, however, would not be so merciful as Keith. Almost as soon as the guards were free of the conference room, a gang of guards found Jason and beat him viciously. They broke his bones, bruised him all over his body, and drew significant amounts of blood. When he was returned to his cell in this state, Keith apologized for the chaos that he had instigated, and which the guards used as an excuse to harm Jason. Remarkably, Jason reassured Keith that he did not need to apologize. He merely asked Keith how he had been doing with genuine care and curiosity. He also warned Keith that the prison would come for him soon as well. Unfortunately, Jason's premonitions were correct. About 2 months later, on October 31st, 1997, Keith was approached in his cell by a, quote, goon squad, unquote, of guards. They ordered him to present his hands to them through the bars so that they could handcuff him. When he agreed and started toward the bars of his cell, he was surprised to hear one of the guards say aloud, Inmate refuses orders." This seems to have been the guards' planned way of justifying what they were about to do to Keith. They then maced, subdued, and began to beat him as brutally as they had beaten Jason. A black guard smashed his head so hard to the ground that he lost consciousness. He was dragged down a flight of stairs and brought to another room where the guards continued this act of pointless, illegal, and cruel vengeance. He came to seeing the blank expressions of the guards as they took turns hitting him as hard as they could, but he felt no pain in that moment. His mind had left his body. Who is that being beaten? He remembers asking himself, evoking the image of a Buddhist monk in the midst of transcendent meditation. He lost consciousness again as their brutality continued. However, when he came to again, alone and naked in his cell, pain, quote, cascaded through his body like lava. He realized in that moment that they had come close to killing him. He knew that according to the administrative rules of the prison, guards were allowed to kill inmates if they resisted being taken from their cell. The guards' dishonest claim that Keith had resisted his cell extraction before his beating exemplifies a continued mockery of justice perpetrated by the prison. While Keith's body began a long process of healing that evening, the temperature was close to freezing as night fell. Though he tore a hole in his mattress and put himself inside it, the guards took his mattress away and shackled him on the next day. 3 days later, Keith was finally given clothes, a mattress, and sheets. Keith slept for weeks after this incident. During this time, the prison effectively disappeared Keith, as his fellow prisoners and the world at large did not know where he was. Marianne Cruz Blanchong, a memory of the Ohio Death Row Supporting Project, wrote a letter to the warden of Mansfield Correctional Institution. She tried to call upon their mercy in her letter, stating rightly that people use violence to break each other's spirits, and that the treatment of Keith constituted cruel and unusual punishment. Another communication to the warden informed them that a fellow prisoner in a nearby cell, David Sneed, had corroborated Keith's claim that he had not resisted his cell extraction. Eventually, Keith's attorney, Herman Carson, was notified of the fact that Keith had been incommunicado for weeks on end. Carson learned that the warden had claimed that Keith had thrown urine on a guard. This assertion smacks of a plagiarism of a lewd scene in the horror movie Silence of the Lambs. Considering the absurdity of this claim and the relentless misery the prison system had subjected Keith and other prisons to, it should ring false to us. As his body healed, Keith's mind and spirit meditated deeply on his fate. His death sentence, the torture of prison, and the death of his beloved grandparents had sent him into a quicksand of grief, understandable anger, and chaos. 2 months later, the prison finally returned him to a cell near the other members of the Lucasville Five. Though his wounds had healed, his sense of self was still battered. Though they had already been harmed so greatly, the Lucasville Five anticipated still further harms. One of their members, Sadiq Abdullah Hassan, was one of the Sunni Muslims who had instigated the Lucasville prison uprising. One afternoon, a group of guards forced Hassan to take the very tuberculosis test that he objected to taking at Lucasville for religious reasons. Though he tried to resist, they forced him to the ground and jabbed a needle in his arm. In so doing, they violated his First and Eighth Amendment rights and subjected him to the same traumatic experience that had begun this agonizing period of his life. In Chapter 6, Death Row 2, Keith introduces the metaphor of quicksand. It begins with a quotation of an article about how to survive this challenge from wikihow.com. Breathe deeply, as you will be more buoyant. Take your time. This recalls Keith's grandfather's advice to him in their last phone call. In the weeks and months after his beating, Keith started to hear and listen to his inner voice. He heard it say, "Calm down. Go slow. You need help." Help would come shortly thereafter. George introduced him to Stoughton and Alice Lind, two civil rights attorneys that would come to be part of his community of trusted, caring people outside of prison. He and the other members of the Lucasville Five had heard rumors that they might be moved to a supermax prison. Though this prospect was daunting, Keith felt a greater sense of poise in this period of life than he might have previously. When he was awoken one night and informed that he was being moved to Ohio State Penitentiary, he listened to the gracious counsel of his inner voice. "Don't even worry about it," the voice said. However, the drive to the supermax prison was terrifying. He was handcuffed in the back of a van speeding down the highway without a seatbelt. He had recently read a newspaper article of a prisoner dying in a traffic accident while being transferred. "Please, God, don't let me die like this," he prayed. As his transport vehicle entered Youngstown, the town in which the supermax had been built, he observed a community that had been economically and culturally devastated by plutocracy. When he arrived at the prison, he was greeted by a group of about 30 heavily armed men with aviator sunglasses. Their machismo mannerisms were blatantly affected, and though he had, quote, never seen such hatred and hostility, unquote, in others, it felt staged. He wondered to himself, who are they trying to impress? The admittance was very tense for everybody involved. Him, the guards, and the lady whose hands shook as she photographed his naked body. As Keith empathically noted the photographer's sense of dehumanization, Baldwin's sage advice is relevant again. Keith notes in this passage that you can't dehumanize someone without dehumanizing yourself in the process. Page 114. As he was strip-searched, he wondered if this emasculation was similar to the dehumanization of slaves as they arrived in America. Keith was then brought into an extremely cold room and was ordered to watch a video. The video was of the warden addressing new prisoners with an outright threat. "Follow the rules here or suffer the consequences at Ohio State Penitentiary." A local prosecutor then chimed in with his own storm and stress. Keith states that this was the continuation of the long process to try to break him. Jason, who had also been moved to Ohio State Penitentiary, informed him of the work of a psychologist named Edward Schreier, who had published a methodology of, quote, how to break men's minds, unquote, for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The use of this methodology shamefully confirmed the concerns of Marion Cruz Blanching, the member of the Ohio Death Row Supporting Project, who had written the letter to Mansfield Correctional Institution. Keith would eventually learn that two of the methodology's processes were to, quote, suppress revolutionary attitudes among the prisoners, segregate natural leaders from the general population of inmates, and then correct him. As the robotic guards put him into his cell, however, Keith held fast to the advice of another crucial thinker in the canon of civil rights and prisoner advocacy, George Jackson. Never allow yourself to be counted among the broken ones. Page 119. After refusing his first several meals to his confused guards, he continued his daily practice of stretching, sun salutations, yoga, and other exercises. These practices helped him to remember his grandfather's advice and to listen to the wisdom of his inner voice. During the first week of orientation to the Ohio State Penitentiary, Keith would learn that there is a rhetorical violence written into the design of the destruction of the prison and its nomenclature. The space for, quote, outdoor recreation, unquote, is a tiny cell with a small slit window to the outside that one can barely see through. But as these daily smaller harms continued, Keith resolved to never let the guards spray, attack, or degrade him ever again. I would not give them the satisfaction, he asserts powerfully on page 123. He resolved to resist the prison's torture with his heart and his mind, not his hands. Channeling the author, psychologist, and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl, he states on page 124 that this was my only goal, to live in such a way that my life would not have been in vain. He felt that he owed it to himself, his grandparents, and his community within and beyond the prison. Finally, he would come to devote himself to continuing the development of his talent as a writer. The pen is mightier than the sword, after all, he knew. Meanwhile, evidence of Dr. Shine's methodology to break men's minds began to be more readily apparent. During his orientation, the guards placed a black and white TV without knobs that only played the prison's informational videos in his cell. Many of his prisoners were not the, quote, worst of the worst, unquote, as the prison had claimed. They were, instead, men with mental illness and men who had committed minor infractions. However, within the first several weeks of his time at Ohio State Penitentiary, Keith suddenly learned of a small but important victory. A hunger strike taken on by George and Hassan had won them several new affordances: newspapers, 4 books each, magazines, sweatsuits, bars of soap, personal razors, socks, t-shirts, and the knobs of their televisions. The allowance of 4 books was a complicated triumph for Keith. 4 books would be better than no books, as he says on page 127, but Keith had 50 books total among his confiscated possessions. This meant that he would have to choose what to do with the remaining 46. Keith and Jason donated the rest of their books to the Ohio State Penitentiary Library. Keith chose to keep the following books: Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, Richard Wright's Black Boy, Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, and Shunryu Suzuki's Zen Mind, Beginner Mind. Viktor Frankl would help him survive the daily challenges of prison life, as Frankl's memoir is largely a meditation on his survival of the Holocaust. Richard Wright would help him to capture the essence of a story and to enrich his writing style. Khalil Gibran would help him follow his grandfather's counsel, rid his heart of bitterness, and turn his heart to the reverence of God. Finally, Shunryu Suzuki would help him listen to his inner voice and master his thoughts and emotions. Later in his incarceration, Keith was allowed more books, but for the time being, these works were the glue that held together his life. Page 129. On August 13, 1998, the 4th District Court of Appeals upheld his conviction and death sentence. Though this was obviously still a continued source of great stress, his attitude about his circumstance was changing. He was unsurprised by their ruling and had begun to develop a greater sense of calm and focus. He had 17 years until his scheduled execution. To ameliorate the stress of this time period, he practiced relating to his experience in smaller units of time, from years to months to weeks to days. He began to meditate several times daily. This helped him slough off the provocations of the prison's pointless tortures, both large and small. When he returned one day to his cell to find his things scattered and a picture of his grandmother in his toilet, he was able to maintain greater calm than he might have previously. He knew that his grandmother was not a picture, but, quote, someone who lived deep within the private chambers of my heart, unquote. Page 130. He connected with and lived by her memory, by remembering her teaching him the story of Job. Keep your faith in God, she had said, and Satan cannot touch you. This greater equanimity proved pivotal as the chaos continued all around him. Many prisoners attempted suicide, and 2 had been successful. A prison official who had felt a pang of conscience reached out to Stoughton and Alice Lind, the aforementioned civil rights attorneys Keith had met through George. The Linds sent a letter to 100 prisoners asking them, if the Ohio State Penitentiary could make you feel your life is worth living, what could they do? While Keith had grown in his calm and focus, he answered their question with complete honesty. He stated simply that the prison tortures, humiliates, and dehumanizes the prisoners every day. He woke every day with the knowledge that this was just about all he could expect, and that this was unlikely to change. The prison is a plutocratic institution. It is, again, another socio-political mechanism by which wealthy people harm and exploit poor and working people. Instead of depending on the prison to change, therefore, each of the prisoners needed to look within to find their self-worth. One must meditate, work out, keep a journal, and stretch before he goes to sleep, Keith recommended. Though it was hard to be around so much pain, he felt, quote, something highly intelligent and indestructible in himself. This concludes my review of chapters 5 and 6 of Condemned. In next week's letter, I will review the final 2 chapters of the book. I hope you can feel, Governor Dewine, that Keith's story so far is a compelling narrative of heroic transcendence in the face of barbaric injustice. I hope you can, as I have said, learn from his story and practice true strength, the practice of merciful nonviolence. I hope you can reject the temptation towards blustery, weak, and false tough guy violence. While I hope that my summary and the book itself might provide some feelings of inspiration, I want you to remember a fundamental circumstance of your life. Before you leave office in January of 2027, you have a choice to make. You can either act in a strong, merciful, and non-violent way, grant Keith full clemency, and set him free. In so doing, you would allow this wonderful man to enjoy the rest of his life and share his gifts with the world, to heal and transform its sufferings into art, shared human wisdom, and communal harmony. Alternatively, you can allow the state of Ohio to take this man's life after more than 30 years of torture. In so doing, you would allow an innocent, deserving, and precious man to be killed viciously by electric chair or lethal injection. You would also deprive the world of a great moral hero, philosopher, writer, teacher, and profoundly compassionate person. You can do the right thing, Governor Dewine. You can listen to your inner voice, act calmly and mercifully, and set Keith LaMar free. Sincerely, David Roush. Do the right thing, Governor. Set Keith LaMar free.